Okay, good evening, everyone, and welcome. My name is Kathy Wilson. I'm the mayor of Morris Township. Our apologies for starting a few minutes late. We had a couple of tech glitches, and we're ready to get going right now. We're here tonight to present an education session for the public on pilot agreements. PILOT is an acronym that stands for Payment in Lieu of Taxes. Pilots, we all know, have been in the news lately, and they do have significant impacts on our taxes. How those effects are calculated is extremely complex, and frankly, it's confusing. My nickname for tonight's session is Pilots 101. Our goal is to share basic factual information about pilots in a way that is understandable to the general public. Our presenters will address such questions as, what is a pilot? How do pilots work? Why are they enacted? And what are the effects of pilots on taxpayers, municipalities, and school districts? As you may know, we in Morris Township will be holding a public hearing this Thursday, November 12th, on a pilot agreement that is proposed for the Abbey. We're not here tonight to discuss the particulars of that proposal. Instead, our purpose here tonight is to provide general information about pilots that we hope will be helpful to all prior to Thursday's more detailed hearing on the Abbey pilot in particular. Given all there is to know about pilots, chances are good that we will be doing at least one more of these education sessions in the future. So with that as background, let me introduce our presenters in the order that they'll be sharing their remarks. Jeff Lehrer is the Township's redevelopment attorney. Redevelopment is a specialized area of the law. Pilots are a subcategory of redevelopment law. Jeff is extremely knowledgeable about pilots. He will address many of the questions tonight's session is designed to answer. Kathy Biarenko is our tax assessor. Kathy plays a key role in determining the assessed value of every property in Morris Township. Kathy will provide background information on how your property taxes are calculated and about equalization, which are key understandings in how pilots impact your taxes. Tim Quinn is our township administrator. Tim knows every detail of how our budget works. He will address the impact of pilots on our municipal budget process. Deputy Mayor Jeff Grayzel is also here this evening. Jeff and I are serving as the representatives of the Township Committee at tonight's meeting. We'll both be contributing questions and comments throughout tonight's session. So with that, I'd like to get started. Mr. Lehrer.
Thank you, Mayor, if I may, before Mr. Lehrer goes, I would just like to state some sort of ground rules for tonight. I know that the committee and the public are very well aware that there is a pilot agreement up this week at Thursday's meeting. That is accomplished by ordinance, and ordinances are accomplished by public hearings. So any discussion of that particular pilot tonight could prove legally problematic. So I just want to caution the public as well as the members of the Township Committee from speaking directly to that particular pilot. And I hope that tonight's discussion of pilots and how they work and what they are in a general sense is informative to that discussion this Thursday. That's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Carlson. So with that, Mr. Lehrer, we'll turn over to you.
Thank you, Scott. I appreciate you saying that, because I certainly will not be getting into anything related to the Abbey for the reasons you stated. Thank you, Mayor. Thank you, Deputy Mayor, for having this presentation. I think it's an important tool for the public to understand. The topic we're going to talk about, pilots, there actually is no word pilot in the law. It's payments in lieu of taxes are just what's used for a common term for annual service charge. So a pilot is the common name for what is legally referred to as an annual service charge under the long-term tax exemption law, which is, you'll find that at NJSA 40A:20-1 and sec. It is a complex law. It took me about 8 reads of the law when it first came out in order for me to fully understand it. And I still have, call friends that are in the redevelopment business, the lawyers, we exchange thoughts on various aspects of the law. It's extremely complex. It is a misnomer for the public to think of the redeveloper receiving an exemption from taxation. That is really not true. Instead, the redeveloper is paying what I call an annual service charge, or what is commonly referred to as a payment in lieu of taxes. And also, real estate taxes are also commonly referred to as ad valorem taxes. And it's only a project which has been determined by the Township Committee, the governing body, to be an area in need of rehabilitation or redevelopment that qualifies for a pilot under the long-term tax exemption law. You cannot receive pilot treatment unless you've been declared an area in need of redevelopment or an area in need of rehabilitation. The difference between an area in need of redevelopment and an area in need of rehabilitation, I can get into, it's really not the topic of this discussion, but just in summary, a redevelopment area is one that meets one of the 13 criteria under the local redevelopment and housing law, functional obsolescence, that it's been blighted, and that has a constitutional underpinning to it as to what constitutes blight. The New Jersey Constitution actually uses the term blight. So the redevelopment area is one that is essentially blighted. An area in need of rehabilitation is an area where the infrastructure is at least 50 years of age or older, and basically in pretty bad shape. So they use an area in need of rehabilitation as a mechanism to for those areas that don't meet the criteria under a redevelopment area, that they might meet the criteria under a rehabilitation area. The long-term tax exemption law, we sometimes refer to it as the LTTE, provides the financial details as to how a pilot is calculated and approved. There are, in essence, 2 laws which provide for, if you could go back one slide, there are 2 laws that,
Can I interrupt you? This is that having a hard time hearing you.
Sure.
Right?
Is that better? There are, in essence, 2 laws which provide for the ability of a municipality and a developer, also called a redeveloper in the redevelopment law, to seek a payment in lieu of taxes or a pilot. The local redevelopment and housing law is found in New Jersey statutes 40A:12A-1 et sec. And it's essentially a procedural law related to how areas are in need of redevelopment and in areas in need of rehabilitation are adopted and conceived and created. The long-term tax exemption law.
Next one.
No, you're not on the right. There you go. Long-term tax exemption law provides the financial details as to how a pilot is calculated and approved. And now you can move on to the next one. As I mentioned, the annual service charge is based on, that's what the mechanism is. It's the annual service charge. And some people may say, well, is it taxes or is it not? It's treated like taxes, but it's really not taxes. It's an annual service charge. You're technically not even supposed to write those off on your taxes. Some people try to, some accountants allow that to happen, but the law is pretty clear that annual service charge is not a write-off against your income taxes, like real estate taxes are. And in New Jersey, we have a $10,000 annual, cap based upon federal law. There's two mechanisms actually under the local long-term tax exemption law to calculate the annual service charge. One is based upon the annual gross revenue. So the annual gross revenue is how much gross revenue is received by the redeveloper from the project in any particular year. Or where it's technically, and I'm going to read the language, where it's technically not easy or reasonable to be able to calculate what the annual gross revenue would be, you use total project cost. And the language is pretty clear, and I just want to spend a minute reading it. It says, at the option of the township, or where because of the nature of development, ownership, use, or occupancy of the project, if the project is to be undertaken in units, the total annual rental or gross shelter rent or annual gross revenue cannot be reasonably ascertained. The governing body shall provide in the financial agreement that the annual service charge shall be a sum equal to the percentage of total project cost. And so that's determined when there's substantial completion of the project. But they have to certify through their architect what the total project cost will be. We've only used it in Morris and Township since in the 5 years that I've been redeveloping council. We've used it on the commercial project for the Colgate, on the Colgate site. That site is comprised of 3 actual pilots. One is the affordable housing pilot, then there's the market rate units, the housing units, and then there's the commercial component. When we were going through that pilot, the commercial pilot, we found it, Kathy and I and Tim found it very difficult to be able to ascertain what the annual gross revenue would be, to use the annual gross revenue as the mechanism to determine annual service charge. So we use TPC. And that is how the commercial component works. You can't go any more on TPC. The minimum is 2%. On AGR, the annual gross revenue, the percentage is usually between 10 and 15%, but there is no cap on that. There is no higher number or ceiling on what AGR can be. However, there reaches that point in where it just becomes so hard and difficult for a redeveloper to make the project work if the AGR is too high, that they'll walk away from the project and say, no, thank you. I have seen AGRs as high as 15%. I've not seen them higher. It's a rare occasion if you do see it, but I guess it does happen. But there's a tipping point where they say, you know what, I'd rather just pay regular taxes than pay the AGR. When you're talking about affordable housing projects, and I mean 100% affordable housing projects, it can't be an inclusionary site where only a portion of the project is affordable housing. If it's a 100% affordable housing project, the AGR can be no more than 10%. So they're treated differently. 100% affordable housing projects, the AGR can be no more than 10%. The TPC for an affordable housing project can be no more than 2% in an affordable housing project. But again, it has to be a 100% affordable housing project. So once the calculation is made, and it's a complicated process to go through all of the numbers, but once you negotiate and sit down and do that, from that total amount of annual income that's received, the township receives 95% of the ASC, or the annual service charge. The county receives 5% of that amount. The school district receives no dollars, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. So there is a real benefit in many occasions for the township to do a pilot because, for instance, in Morris Township, the municipal share of taxes, of overall taxes, is about 26%.
23%.
Right, 23%. So it's 23 cents on every dollar, while when you use a pilot, you're receiving 95 cents on every dollar, and the township receives that money and can do various projects that they have not been able to do in otherwise normal circumstances. So can you move on to the next slide? Pilots provide a significant incentive for redevelopers to engage in projects that likely would not happen but for, and I use the words in bold, but for, the incentive of a pilot. The long-term tax exemption law makes you go through this process. The developer has to prove to the municipality that but for a pilot, the project would not work. It's a complicated, again, analysis, but in the application that they provide, which is the first step, they have to show us that but for the vehicle of a pilot, this particular project would not happen. It would not work. And that can be for a variety of reasons, which we'll get into. But for essentially a project that is not financially feasible under regular taxation can be viable with a pilot. There can be environmental problems with a site that just make it untenable to be able to work through regular taxes because of the cleanup costs. So then a pilot might work in that circumstance. Pilots provide a measure of stability with regard to tax obligations, which can allow a redeveloper to attract good quality tenants and increasing the likelihood of successful project long term. I can remember sitting in one of the conference rooms here where the redeveloper said, I just can't make this project work. The tenants, the retail market is what it is. They will not go beyond a certain dollar amount on rent. And I can't make this project work unless I get a pilot that makes sense. So it is a long negotiation, and it is a negotiation because the long-term tax exemption law provides the flexibility to negotiate. I bring the information back to the governing body. We go back and forth with the redeveloper time after time, and ultimately there is an agreement struck. And at that point, and we'll get into the process. So, pilots allow for an area of redevelopment to be transformed. So we have an area that's been deemed to be an area in need of redevelopment, meaning that it's lighted, it's functionally obsolescent, it's not really working, and it doesn't necessarily have to be a project that looks like it's just beat up for years. It can look like an attractive office building, but functionally obsolescent. For instance, in Bridgewater, the very controversial site, the Sanofi site, that office building was about 30 years old, but it couldn't be used because of the large corridors. The way that office buildings are working now, or functioning now, are not the way office buildings were functioning 30 years ago, or even 20 years ago. So
No, he
they're
should be able to
functionally
get right back in.
obsolescent, and therefore you can call them an area in need of redevelopment, therefore allowing a pilot to be used. Keep in mind, though, that some projects are undertaken without a pilot, and they do pay regular taxes. Some developers just say, and for the reasons that I'll get into, I'm not going to limit myself by a pilot because there is a limitation on the amount of profit that they can make if they take the pilot route. They have to create an urban renewal entity to the state. They have to agree to certain limitations on their profit, which I'll talk about in a few minutes. So it's not every project that is an area in need of redevelopment where a pilot automatically comes into play. That's just not the case. There are many, many areas in need of redevelopment where there's just a redevelopment agreement. Developer builds his project, gets planning board approval, and proceeds without a pilot. So pilots create new revenue for municipalities. They can result in new jobs for municipalities. In fact, one of the things that they have to do, a developer, a redeveloper, in the very thick application that they submit to begin the process, is they have to provide how many new jobs are being created in their estimation for the municipality. For instance, not only construction jobs, but actually permanent jobs once the project is built. That information is to be provided in the application that is presented. One of the other benefits is that in a redevelopment area, and some of you may, I refer to it as the Kelly Bill, but some refer to it as the Condo Services Act, where municipalities are required to pay for leaf pickup or reimburse for lighting, leaf pickup, and snow removal. The Redevelopment Act says that you can, if you put it in your financial agreement, the municipality is exempt from that obligation. So that money stays with the township, as opposed to reimbursing condominiums. The developer is well aware and negotiating that they are losing their right to receive those reimbursements under the Kelly Bill. So that's one of the other benefits to the municipality. They also result in new ratables. The pilot term is 30 years. It actually is, it's the greater of 30 years from the date the project's done, or 35 years from the date the financial agreement is signed. Sometimes a developer waits a year or two to get its approvals, and then can't really start because of agencies like the DEP or the NGDOT. So the date that they sign the financial agreement, which is the agreement that memorializes the pilot, there's technically 35 years. But once the project receives its first CO, it automatically goes to 30 years. So it's no more than 30 years from the date that they get a CO until the expiration of the 30 years that they get the benefit of the pilot. After that, the project reverts back to normal taxes. Can you just go on to the next? So here's how the process works. A redeveloper will normally write to the township governing body and say, I'd like to have this area designated as an area in need of redevelopment. Or the township works with a redeveloper because they know that the project needs to be redeveloped. So the first step is that the township committee refers the matter to the planning board to conduct what's called a preliminary investigation to determine if the project meets one or more of the criteria under the local redevelopment and housing law. And there are 13 of them. And if you can just take a minute, I'll tell you what some of those criteria are to qualify as an area in need of redevelopment. Okay. The generality of the buildings are substandard, unsafe, unsanitary, dilapidated, or obsolescent, or possess any of the characteristics of those, or are so lacking in light, air, or space as to be conducive to unwholesome living or working conditions. The discontinuation of the use of a building or building previously used for commercial, retail, shopping malls or plazas, office parks, manufacturing or industrial purposes, the abandonment of such building or buildings, significant vacancies of such building or buildings for at least 2 consecutive years, or the same being allowed to fall in so great a state of disrepair as to be untenantable. And then it goes on to talk about areas with buildings or improvements which by reason of dilapidation, obsolescence, overcrowding, faulty arrangement or design, lack of ventilation, light and sanitary facilities, excessive land coverage, etc., that make it detrimental to the safety, health, morals, and welfare of the community. And the list goes on. I'm not going to cover all of them, but essentially it's if the planning board finds that through public hearing, that one or more of those criteria is satisfied, they then adopt a resolution, send it back to the governing body and say, yes, we have determined that this property meets one or more of those criteria. They can also say that we don't find that all of the property meets those criteria, that maybe some of it does. Or they can come back and say none of it meets any of the criteria. If it's none of those criteria, they say, no, we don't find any of it met, game over. The process of using redevelopment is over. The process of using a pilot is done. The planning board has the ability to say, we don't find that this redeveloper has satisfied or this site has satisfied any of those criteria. So if there is a designation resolution, the recommendation of a redevelopment designation, it comes back to the governing body. The governing body then makes the determination, and they don't have to make this determination, but if they do want to move forward, it's not an obligation, they have a right to designate it as an area in need of redevelopment, a designation of an area in need of redevelopment or an area in need of rehabilitation. Can you go on to the next slide, please? Remember that the planning board recommendation has to be supported by substantial credible evidence. And I have seen cases, there's one that came out of Bedminster where they wanted to turn the old salt building from the DPW into a retail shopping center. And Judge Miller made a formal determination that's substantial through 100 pages of reading that substantial credible evidence was provided by the redeveloper and its experts that the property did meet the burden of substantial credible evidence and showing that the property met one or more of the criteria. So at every step of this game, every step of this process, I'm not going to call it a game, it's not a game, every step of this process, there is the opportunity for someone to challenge. So the planning board's recommendation by resolution can be challenged by neighbors and taken to court. They have a certain period of time under law, it's 45 days from the adoption of the resolution to challenge that, and that is reviewed by a court. But let's assume that the recommendation comes to the governing body, there's no challenge, the governing body then designates the property for redevelopment or rehabilitation. It is only then that a redeveloper has a right to come to the municipality and say, I want a pilot because my project won't work otherwise. The resolution that is adopted by the governing body is sent to the township clerk, by the township clerk, to the New Jersey Department of Community Affairs for their review and approval. If the DCA director, I think he's called, director determines that it doesn't fall within a growth area, he can write back and say, no, I don't believe it does. The governing body then has the ability to challenge that. But most of the time, I would say 98% of the time, the commissioner will write back and say, thank you, we think this is a great idea, please proceed, you are authorized to proceed, and the governing body has the ability to go forward. Can you go to the next step? Next slide. Once the governing body says, we will work with you to do a pilot, an urban renewal entity has to be formed, and it has to be formed like the way you form any other corporation, limited liability company, and it has to also be approved by the DCA commissioner and then by the Treasury Department. So you can see the technical steps that are involved in getting from A to Z. So they have to create an urban renewal entity, and the urban renewal entity has limitations on the amount of profit it can make. Again, we'll talk about that in a minute. But it's a big step for a redeveloper to do because they then are saying, we know we're regulated on the amount of profit we can make, but we want to do this because it's the only way we can build this project. So the negotiation of a pilot can be complex because at a minimum, the Township Committee has required the redeveloper to provide what's called a pro forma of its anticipated revenues. And Kathy and Tim and I have worked on multiple pro formas. Pro forma is where they're coming in with what their accountant is saying, this is how this project can work economically. We have to pour through all of that documentation to see if it's accurate, to see if there are flaws in it, to see if there are flaws in valuation, flaws in any other economic aspect of the pro forma. And believe me, the pro forma that they provide is normally riddled with problems so that we always have to correct, negotiate to make sure that what we're receiving is the best for Morris Township. So it's the real game is to determine whether the pilot versus ad valorem taxes makes sense for the township. And it has to make sense for the township. And if so, it would advance toward a financial agreement. If it doesn't make sense, then the governing body will say, we just don't want to do this. We don't have the obligation to do it, and we're not going to do it. But if it does make sense, there are significant benefits to a municipality by doing the pilot, which we'll get into. Next slide, please. I had talked about the profits of an urban renewal entity are limited. They are limited to the greater of 12% per year, where 1.25% plus the redeveloper's annual percentage rate on the initial permanent mortgage that they take out. If they don't take out mortgage financing, then it's the percentage that the municipality determines. So if they don't use mortgage financing to build a project, it's the prevailing rate of interest that the municipality determines to be prevailing rate, not what the developer determines to be the prevailing rate. So it's 1.25% plus the annual percentage rate on the permanent mortgage, or what the governing body determines that permanent mortgage rate will be. If at the end of the year, once the pilot kicks in, the profits are beyond those limits, that money is remitted to the township. And there is an annual audit that's done by agreement that they open their books to the municipality and have to provide an annual audit. And we have the right to ask for more information if we don't think that they're giving accurate information. So during the term of a pilot, the township has the right to double check, triple check through an audit annually, all the revenue of the urban renewal entity, with a copy of that audit to be provided to the Division of Local Government Services within the Department of Community Affairs. There is our checks and balances to make sure that the redeveloper is staying honest. And as I said, this limitation on profits of the URE ensures that the township and its residents receive any windfall from the redeveloper. And I have seen situations where at the end of the year, there is more than a 12.5% profit, and the windfall does go, that goes to the township. That money goes into the township's coffers, not the redevelopers. I've covered the basics. It's more complex than what I talk about. So for instance, for a condominium project, the formula to calculate is too complex for me to talk about in this session. I can only tell you that it took about a couple of years for us to, for you guys to finally figure it out, but
Still working on it.
we're still working on it. But it's based upon a complicated formula on what a normal mortgage rate would be, using prevailing mortgage rates on a 30-year mortgage rate. And then you throw in there the AGR. I don't want to get into the complexities of it because I'll probably confuse myself. So yes, there are three types. There's affordable housing pilots, there are market rate condominium pilots, there are commercial pilots, and they all have their own different unique characteristics.
Thank you, Mr. Lehrer. I don't know if the people in the audience can see, but he's got a book that's about 4 inches high, which is his, I assume it's sort of your Bible on
It is. It is.
Yeah, so thank you for that summary. And you can see just from that how complex it is. So with that as background, general background on pilots, I think is, which one?
Kathy would be going next. Mayor?
Yes.
A couple of people have asked if there's going to be opportunity for public questions, so they
Yes.
asked if you could clarify that.
Yes, thank you. I did need to clarify that. At the beginning, I meant to say that we will allow an opportunity for questions following each presenter. So I did, I believe, see at least one person from the public who had their digital hand raised. And
Not now.
If anybody would like to ask a question, to raise their hand, and you can let them in to ask the question.
yeah, if anyone from the public has any questions, if you can raise your digital hand, we'll call on you and go from there. I don't see anyone, do you?
You have one.
Mr. Sims?
We have one.
Okay,
Name is Lee.
Lee? Okay, Lee. Are you there, Lee?
He's muted.
Yep, I'm here. Yep.
You're muted at your end.
Yep.
He's-
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Great. Thank you. So I just had just a general question. So here in New Jersey, with, I guess, something like 565 municipalities, is there any sense of trying to get a sense of here in New Jersey, the order of magnitude or usage of these pilots across the state? If you had to put a guesstimate on it, would you say 50% of municipalities, or is there any data that you can provide in terms of that?
I can only tell you that I've represented 8 municipalities as redevelopment counsel, and every single one of them have used it in some fashion. And they call me in when they have properties that meet those, that really are in bad shape, that it's pretty obvious that they would qualify as an area in need of redevelopment. So some of the towns that are more, such as Alpine, New Jersey, I can't imagine why they would have a pilot. But I can't give you a percentage.
Okay, thank you.
A lot.
It's a lot. Okay,
Or-
and
Urban environment and a
Yes.
urban environment?
More in an urban environment. Well, I was town attorney in Edison, and we used, for the former Ford plant, you may recall on Route 1, that was sitting there for years, falling into disrepair, and it clearly met the criteria for an area in need of redevelopment. These towns that have just allowed their infrastructure to just deteriorate, there are some of the buildings that just, for instance, in Manville, some of those buildings just have fallen into such disrepair that you just know it when you see it.
Jeff, if I'm not mistaken, I believe the long-term tax exemption law was modified a few years back to include those office buildings that you were talking about
Yes.
too.
Yeah.
The obsolete maybe deteriorating office buildings?
Yeah, and good question. That's a really good point, that there is a percentage, so they have to show that for the past 2 years, the vacancy rate has been so high that it just makes it untenable for them to continue to function. And that was a recent amendment to local redevelopment and housing law.
Thank you.
Great.
Do you have any further questions?
I just have a further follow-up question that I'm interested in perhaps
Sure.
learning about in terms of just reading about pilots on my own and the the literature that's out there on the web and just trying to educate yourself on them. More often than not, it always seems to be sort of directed towards charities and nonprofits, so to speak, in terms of what the pilots are being used for, which got me to thinking, do you see any movement or in the work that you do across other municipalities where they're beginning to now maybe approach nonprofits to sort of make a contribution or call it a pilot or something along those lines, because they're using city services or municipal services as well? Is there any thing you can report on that in terms of nonprofits and how they're viewed?
Lee, is it Mr. Lee, or is your first name Lee?
My first name is Lee.
Lee, that's an interesting question, because the pilots are normally done by redevelopers, not charitable organizations. So you may be talking about a different program where the HMFA or HUD allows certain
Right.
certain kinds of programs for affordable housing. And I have done HMFA projects where the profit is municipality is about 5%. It's hardly anything. But most of the pilots are done by redevelopers under the long-term tax exemption law, not under HMFA or HUD laws.
Okay. Thank you for clarifying that. Appreciate it.
Anybody else?
Is that it? Mr. Goldberg, or are you?
Put his hand down.
Oh, you put his hand down. Okay, I see another hand from a distance. I can't read the name.
Mike, Bill, Kathryn.
Mike? Mike, could you please say your name for the record?
I'm trying to get him to talk
Unmute.
and it wants him to promote to panelist. It won't,
Okay, is there anyone else? Maybe we could come back to Mike?
he's using an older version of Zoom, that's why.
You want to promote him to panelist too? But then you would have to remove.
I can remove him in.
Okay, I'll have to sign back in after he's done.
Okay.
All right.
All right, so Mike, are you there?
Is he,
Is he there?
he's not even,
Okay, I think we should move on. Mike, we're having trouble getting you recognized here. So if you want to raise your hand again, we'll try one more time. In the meantime, is there anyone else? No? Okay. I guess you explained it so clearly, no one has any questions. Okay, thank you. Kathy Viarengo, I believe, is up next.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Kathy Biarenko, and I'm the tax assessor for the Township of Morris. I may have spoken with some of you over the years. I was asked to come here tonight to speak a little bit about equalization. Equalization is something that you may not have heard of, or you may have heard of and you don't know exactly what it is. And my point in being here tonight is to try to give you a basic idea of what it is. So, what is equalization and why is it important? The definition of equalization is that it is the process by which aggregate assessed values of real property in a taxing district are brought to true value. In essence, what equalization does is take assessed values and turn them into something approximating market values so that the state and the county can compare property values from district to district or county to county. What's involved in calculating the equalization ratio is a one-year study of the ratio between the cumulative assessed values and the cumulative, what are called usable sales that have occurred over the past year. The resulting number is then averaged with the prior year equalization ratio to come up with the current year equalization ratio. Equalization is necessary in districts like ours where we don't do annual reassessment. We did our last revaluation for 2016, and in general, assessed values have not changed since then, unless improvements are made to the property, in which case they're adjusted to reflect those improvements. However, during the time period since 2016, certainly market values have changed. Most notably over the past 6 months or so, when the market's just been going a little crazy. So in order to, as I said, reflect what those assessed values would be in terms of market value, equalization is necessary. So the state has certain uses for equalization. One way is to use it to measure how to distribute state school aid. Another is to measure how much money a municipality can borrow or bond for. And another is to set the upper limit of how much a school district could bond for. The county also uses equalization because they have a budget, and they need to apportion that amongst the municipalities within the county. So the equalized value of each town is measured against the cumulative total of the county in order to determine the percentage share of each municipality. Of special importance to municipalities like ours is the fact that it's used to distribute or to apportion the joint school district budgets. I'm going to try to go through this quickly because I'm sure some of you are probably not as fascinated by equalization as I am. So just again, to quickly give you an idea of how it's done. For a year between July 1st and June 30th of the following year, the assessor in each municipality receives a copy of every recorded deed. The assessor reviews every one of those deeds. I can tell you in Morris Township, we got well over 600 a year, so it's not an inconsiderable task. The purpose of the review is to determine whether that deed is representative of what's considered to be a market transaction, a usable sale, or a non-usable sale. And when I say usable or non-usable, I mean usable for purposes of the ratio study that I mentioned earlier. So the standard for classifying it as non-usable is based on 33, believe it or not, categories of non-usable deed transactions that are published by the Division of Taxation. And they seem to add to those deed transactions a non-usable deed transactions on a regular basis. So we have more all the time. Once the assessor classifies the sale as usable or non-usable, it's reviewed by the Division of Taxation. They may agree or they may disagree with what the assessor's opinion is. And if they disagree, they let the assessor know about it. And that assessor has the opportunity to communicate more of their reasoning for classifying the sale as non-usable, or just providing more information that might persuade the division that it should be considered non-usable. If sales are considered usable, then they get included in that ratio study. And again, that's just simply a comparison of the ratio or relationship between assessed value and market or true value in each taxing district. Every year, on or about October 1st, the Director of the Division of Taxation publishes the Director's Table of Equalized Valuations, which is the ratio for each municipality in New Jersey. The equalization ratios, are a weighted average of the ratio of the assessed value to usable sale prices. It does include all property types, so, and it includes every neighborhood in a municipality. So it's an imprecise measure, but it's the best that they can do. I put an example of how they extract a ratio from the sale. It's basically, again, just the assessed value of the property at the time of sale, divided by the sale price, and that gives you the ratio. So on the following page, there's an illustration of the effect of the equalization ratio on the net valuation taxable or the assessed values of in the town. You can see in 2017, which was right after we did our revaluation in 2016, we were at very nearly 100% of what's considered market value or equalized valuation. So the two numbers are very close. As time goes on, though, and property values appreciate, generally speaking, the ratio actually declines. It works in inverse relationship to sale prices. So if your prices are increasing, your ratio will be declining. We did have a period in time after the 2008 market crash where our ratios began to climb. And that was a result of the decline in the market values resulting from that crash in 2008. But fortunately, we've been experiencing appreciation in property values, generally speaking, throughout the township, which has resulted in a decline in our ratio. So, as I said, it's a good thing when your ratio declines, but in some ways it does have an impact on taxpayers, particularly when you're measured against other municipalities or counties where they may not be experiencing the same thing that you are. So it's a good thing, but it can also affect your taxes somewhat. The next page, excuse me for 1 second. The next page shows the effect of the equalization ratio on the township's share of the county operating budget. And you can see that, for the most part, it's fairly stable. We did have, between 19 and 20, we had a fairly large increase in our rateable base due primarily to the K-Hovnanian townhouses over at the Honeywell property. And that's a good thing because it brought in a lot more tax dollars to the town, but it did also increase our share of, and that's not the only factor, but it was one factor in increasing our share of the county budget. And again, you're measured against other municipalities in the county. So to some extent, it's a measure of your relative performance compared to theirs. There are towns in Morris County that are not as fortunate as Morris Township and don't have appreciated values. So that's what happens there. So the next slide is an illustration of 4 years of school district cost share. And this slide shows the township share. And you can see most years it's somewhere around 65%. Mr. Quinn is going to address this a little bit more later on, so I won't go into great detail. But the school budget You may notice if you actually look at these slides later on that there's a slight difference in the equalized value on this slide than there is on the prior slide. And that's because the school, or the state really, calculates the equalized value a little bit differently. They use the prior year net valuation taxable and the current year ratio. So it is just slightly different. And that's about all I have to tell you about equalization.
I have a couple of questions for you.
Okay, I was afraid of that.
Okay, so when I think of equalization, I think of trying to establish a yardstick that establishes a common measurement. Okay, so for example, like before we did our reval in 2016, I think the last time we had a reval before that was 2001, 15 years earlier. So in the meantime, there were people whose homes were purchased in 1995, and so the purchase price compared to the current assessed value, they're really changed over the years. And when you do the reval, your ratio becomes 100%. Is that correct?
That's correct.
In other words, all of your assessed values of your homes align with the current market value.
Everyone should be at 100% or as close as possible. I mean, you are doing mass appraisal, so it's, somewhat imprecise in some ways, but generally speaking, yes.
Okay. And so the importance of equalization is, I see it in two parts. One is within your town itself.
Yes.
It's important to apply equalization so that all of the homes within your town are sort of measured in their value according to the same yardstick.
Right.
And then it's also important equalization measuring the value of the total properties in your town compared to other towns.
Other towns, yes.
Okay. And that is particularly important, for example, in determining what your what the number is of your town's taxes that go to the county are based on
Your share.
your share. So, and that's determined by taking the total value of all the properties in your town, right? And dividing it up proportionally according to the value of each of the households.
Well, actually, your share of the county taxes is based on the total value of the municipality measured against the total valuation of all, I think there are 31 municipalities
Correct.
in Morris County. So you're actually being valued as a percentage of the total county equalized value.
Right, each town has a certain portion of the total property value in the whole county.
Right.
And
So Morris Township's assessed valuation is around 5 billion. I'm not even sure what it is currently. I have it with me if you really want to know. But our equalized value and every other municipality's equalized value within the county changes every year. It changes because of additions to the assessed valuation through new construction or improvements to existing properties or demolitions of buildings that removes value from the assessed valuation, or through the application of the equalization ratio. And the relationship of the value of our town changes in relationship to the other towns. They're all changing too. So it's a constantly moving thing.
And so a sort of big idea to me is that taxes are determined based upon your property values.
Yes,
Right.
that's what Jeff mentioned ad valorem earlier. Ad valorem means at value. And that's how properties in New Jersey are assessed at market value.
And determining the tax that an individual taxpayer owes to each of these different taxing bodies that Mr. Quinn is going to talk about is it's partially based on the total value of all the properties in your
Okay.
town,
Mhm.
and the individual taxpayer's tax is based on the value of their home.
Yeah, the individual taxpayer's tax is based on their percentage share or share of the pie. If you view the operating budget of the municipality as a pie, they have a proportionate share in that operating budget based on their assessed value. Assessed value is a means of divvying up the pie.
Right.
It doesn't establish taxes because it's not a budget that establishes taxes, but it does apportion the taxes.
But part of what stands out to me is that two key sort of numbers that are important are the total value of all the properties in your town, one, and the equalized assessed value of each of the individual homes in your town.
Right. For the individual property owner, their individual property assessment is important. For the town as a whole, obviously, it's the cumulative number of all.
Okay,
This,
just wanted to clarify that.
an anomaly that comes with that, Mayor, is use the county, for example, they had a budget with a 0% increase overall for the county.
Mhm.
However, because the sales going on in Morris Township were so good, our residents are paying higher county taxes this year because of the equalized value. So
Okay.
even though you see a zero coming in from the county budget on overall,
Mhm.
the impact on township taxpayers is going to be seen in the slides that I showed that there was an increase
Yes.
because of the equalized value.
As I said, the fact that your properties are appreciating contributes or is what results in the decline in the equalization ratio, which is what results in the increase in the equalized value of the municipality. So it's a good thing that we're in a thriving, strong real estate market, but it does have that impact on the tax.
So the sales in Morris Township are above average.
Yes. Okay. And we are connected. The individual homeowners within a town are connected, and the towns with other towns are connected.
It's all interrelated.
It's interrelated, and those interconnections affect what the actual amount of taxes is that each of us as individuals pays. Is that correct?
Yes, and it also affects how much state aid you get for your school district.
Mhm.
It's used in many ways
Yes.
that, are not apparent.
Okay. Is there anyone from the public who has any questions?
We have one person,
Who is this? I can't see it.
Jeff Brooks.
Jeff Brooks. Can you?
Okay, am I unmuted?
Yes, you
Yes, Jeff.
Great. So, Kathryn, keeping with the theme of the night, I guess the question I have just to confirm that any property that is subject to a pilot program is not included in any way in the cumulative total equalized value of Morris Township, correct? So the 95% that goes to the township is just not in that $5.7 billion number that you showed for 2020, correct?
The 95% refers to the payment. The township receives 95% of the annual service charge or pilot payment in lieu of taxes. What you're talking about is the assessed value for that property if it were to be assessed normally. And that value is not included, you are correct, in the calculation of equalized valuation for the town.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Is there anything else?
So just to clarify what Mr. Brooks just asked, is any portion of a pilot included in the equalized value?
Good question, Deputy Mayor. There is, on a commercial pilot, the land taxes, the developer, the redeveloper does not get the benefit of the pilot on land tax portion. The land tax portion is treated like ad valorem taxes. So 23% goes to the municipality, the school board gets 64%, et cetera. It's the improvement on the property, not the land, on a commercial project that is subject to the pilot. So to answer your question is yes. On a commercial pilot, the land portion is treated the same as any other ad valorem taxes.
In other words, that assessed value for that land portion, that is included in the equalized value for each county. But not the payment is not.
And the value of the improvements is not.
The value of the improvements is not. And actually, Jeff can explain this better than I, but the residential project, for sale project, everything.
Right. There are two conflicting provisions in the long-term tax exemption law, and I'm not going to get into the specifics, but there are those attorneys that take the more optimistic view because the language is conflicting, and most attorneys that are in this area use all of the taxes on residential projects. Land and improvements are exempt from taxation. So it's all glommed together into the annual service charge. But it's the commercial projects where that's different, where the land taxes is treated as that, gets ad valorem treatment. But on a residential project, it's not. It all is included. Land and improvement are included in the annual service charge. They get paid, they get charged the annual service charge. So I just wanted to be clear about that.
Is that by statute and not subject to negotiation?
Well, it's interesting. There are, as I said, two conflicting provisions in the long-term tax exemption law. And I take the position that the land is exempt on residential projects, and it's in the law. There are others that take a contrary position, but not very many. They take the position that land taxes on residential projects are not exempt from taxation, and therefore they have to be credited against the pilot payment. That's not the prevailing view.
And I have one additional question.
Grayzel, go ahead.
Kathy, you told us the last time Morris Township had a revaluation. Is there a best practice for a frequency for revaluing your properties?
Well, actually, most people think it's every 10 years or so. The way it works is that the state monitors certain indicators, the number of appeals that you have, your coefficient of deviation, meaning how far are your sales from your assessments in general, stratified by different property classes. And when you get too far out of whack, so to speak, they order you to do it. The state has been moving for a number of years toward an annual reassessment model. So far, there are 2 counties in the state that do it annually. And then there are various municipalities. For instance, Somerset County, I think 90% of the municipalities in Somerset County do it annually and have been doing it for years. But there are just a few municipalities in Morris County that do it, and for the most part, they're the smaller municipalities where it's a more readily manageable task, because it's a huge job.
Is that where they do 20% a year?
They do 20% a year over a 5-year period, and when I say 20% a year, that's a 20% reinspection rate. So you have to reinspect at least 20% of your properties every 5 years. There's a requirement that you change, I forget exactly what the percentage is, but it's a large percentage of your values must also change in order to do the annual reassessment. It doesn't have to be by a lot, but you have to change them. You have to examine every neighborhood, whether you end up adjusting them significantly or not. It's meant to rebalance the values in neighborhoods. because different neighborhoods appreciate it different and appreciate at different rates. So over time, you can get unbalanced.
Interesting. I didn't realize there were 2 counties that do that already.
Yes, there's a pilot program in Gloucester County. It's been doing it for a number of years.
Not this kind
No,
of. Different meaning, right?
The other kind of pilot, yeah. And Monmouth County just started doing it, and they're testing actually a different assessment schedule for purposes of seeing whether they can reduce refunds on tax appeals to municipalities. So they're both pilot programs.
To me, it just speaks to the importance of equalization.
Yeah.
It's a very
Yeah.
important concept to
Well,
understand.
the idea behind the annual reassessment obviously is to keep you at 100% or close to it.
Mayor, if I could just say 2 more things, just very quickly. One is, I can't tell you how important Tim and Kathy have been to me.
Yeah.
And to the public, you are gifted by these 2 people.
Mhm.
They are wonderful. They get it. They understand the process. The first year was a little bit difficult, but I can tell you it was an education, but they get it.
They're quick learners.
And Kathy has just been an amazing help to me in really maneuvering through the process and negotiating. Tim is just amazing, and you're very, very lucky to have them, because there are towns where it's just painful for me to do the negotiation because I don't get the cooperation that I need. But not only them, but the governing body public has been amazing. They have listened. We've had some heated discussions, but we ultimately come up to an arrangement that works for both sides. So it's been great. The other thing is that you don't adopt a pilot agreement, a financial agreement by resolution. You adopt it by ordinance. It's one of the few agreements under the law that you adopt by ordinance. So you have a first reading and a second reading.
Thank you.
Mr. Brooks, you still have a question?
Yeah, and am I still unmuted?
You're unmuted.
Excellent. So, Mr. Lehrer, just further clarification from the question Mr. Grayzel asked. So you mentioned the Colgate redevelopment is split into 3 separate pilot agreements, one
Yes.
for the affordable housing, one for the residential, and one for the commercial. So in that case, does the commercial portion make an ad valorem annual payment for the land value? And is the land value split between the 3?
So you're right. So they broke it out into a condominium, if I'm not mistaken, or where they subdivided the property into 3 separate parcels. I think it was a subdivision. Yeah, and so the Colgate commercial project is on 1 lot, and they are charged 2%, 3%, and 4% over the course of 30 years on total project cost as their annual service charge. On the residential, it's that very complex formula that I talked about.
Yeah, and you don't need to go into the form. I'm just wondering whether the commercial part actually makes an ad valorem annual payment for the land, assessed land value.
They do. They get credited against the 4 prior quarters. They make the land payment, and they get credited against their annual service charge, the improvement portion, for the prior 4 quarters of land tax that they pay. That's statutory. It's not something that's negotiable. It's statutory.
Okay, thanks.
And so just for further clarification, since on a commercial parcel, the land value is separated from the improvement value, are they making 2 payments then? A land value payment and then the improvements payment in 2 separate payments? So we know.
Yeah,
where they're going.
mechanically, I'm not sure how you do that.
Kathy's not.
I'm not the tax collector. She really should be answering this question, but I believe the way she's doing it is where there's well, actually, I shouldn't say that. We haven't begun to collect the pilot payment on the commercial segment yet because nothing's happening there. But I think in the future, they would be separately billed because they're treated differently. The pilot that we are collecting right now is on the townhouse section, the residential section. And we've just begun this year to collect pilot payments. And what's happening is that the land is still being taxed, and they're paying the land taxes on it until the CO is issued on each townhouse, at which point that townhouse becomes subject to a pilot agreement.
Right.
And
And every time they sell, we have to readjust that.
that's right. Because it is based on the sale price of the units. So right now, what's happening is they're paying the land taxes. The tax collector is billing them once the CO is issued for the pilot. And then the land taxes that they paid for the period, they had to continue to pay through the end of the year, and those taxes are credited against the pilot payment. Next year, they won't pay those land taxes. They will just pay the pilot.
But the land taxes on the commercial parcel are treated as ad valorem.
Yes, and will continue to be, and are being collected now.
And ad valorem in that case means that whatever the total tax is on the land, on the commercial portion, is divided proportionally among the taxing bodies.
It's the same way any property would be, yes. The taxes are divided amongst all.
But we haven't made a collection yet
Yeah, I know.
on anything, so it's a good
Right.
thing to follow up with our CFO
Right.
to see how she plans on taking in those payments.
Well, it's statutory.
Statute.
Yeah.
It's that.
And you collect pilot payments as you collect taxes quarterly. So it's collected, so you can send your bill out like you're sending your tax bill out. It'll just be called an annual service charge. It's not called real estate taxes.
We are receiving a payment from on the Colgate property to ensure that when everything was demolished originally, that we would not lose any tax revenue.
Correct. That's called the minimum annual service charge.
So we were getting this minimum annual service charge since 2017. So to ensure that we did not lose any tax revenue. So we did not lose any tax revenue.
Right.
So that was Jeff had put that in and negotiated that when we had it. So in this period of time for all of the construction, everything else, we were not going to lose any tax revenue for that site.
Right.
Mayor, given the hour, I think we should move on.
Yes. I do want to make sure anyone from the public who has a question gets an opportunity. No more?
No.
Okay, thank you. So, Mr. Quinn.
That shouldn't be too long. So. I only have 3 slides.
Okay.
The first one's easy. You can go to you should have another slide on there after Kathy's. There you go. This just shows where the Morris Township taxpayer, where their tax dollars go. As you will see, it's 23% goes towards municipal services, 15% goes for county services, 2% for the library, and 60% goes to the Morris School District for that. And this is how it gets split up. And what makes it somewhat challenging is comparing is that it is done by an equalized ratio for the school district, the library, and the county. What makes it even more challenging is that the school district budget is on a fiscal year and the township budget is on a calendar year. So we have to split it up in the 2 halves to come up with what's going to be the payment that's going to be required to the school district by township residents. And we work with the school district on that. They are a taxing authority, so they pass a budget and they determine what the value or how much money they need through taxation. This year for the 2021 school year, it's about $95 million. As you look at that, you will see that the school portion of the budget is really the driving factor for that. In Morris Township, we have been able to keep a stable municipal rate. It's actually gone down in 1 year and then stayed that way for the next 3 years. And that is a lot of that work has been accomplished through additional value that has come in from new construction or add-on assessments. Last year, between Mrs. Viarengo and Mr. Mashpatisa, our construction code official, they closed out with COs in the value of approximately $79 million that we were able to add to our aggregate total for assessed value of properties, resulting in approximately just under $400,000 in additional tax revenue. As Mrs. Biarenko said, a lot of that had to do with the completion of the Nanian development over at the Honeywell property. So we have some other developments coming on that we'll see that, but for the most part, we have to find other ways to make sure we have enough funding and try and keep that tax rate down. A number of years ago also, I'd say a number of years, but I think it was 5 or 6 years ago, the state changed the law in reference to the school budgets in that they used to have to be voted on every April. That was changed where the school district could opt out, and if they came in at 2%, it would be done, and they would no longer have to put up the school budget for a vote. More school districts did decide to do that, and basically they've been coming in on a yearly basis of that 2% or pretty close to that 2%. We did have some increases where they have to dip into the cap bank, and they had some exemptions when they put in some security features for all of the schools. But we're seeing that 2% every year, and how do we do that? What is also challenging for us is that we have a joint school district. So it's done by equalized value between Township of Morris and the town of Morristown. Greg, we can go to the next slide. What you will see is it's a pendulum that swings back and forth with that value. Take the assessed value of the properties, equalized assessed values of both municipalities. They are then added together on an annual basis, and then take the school budget and divide it by that portion. So you'll see, for the most part, it's right around that 65-35 split. There is about an equal number of students for both municipalities, but we have a much higher assessed value of property than the town of Morristown, and that's where you get that 65-35 split. As I said, we're looking for additional sources of revenue to help keep that budget stable, and pilots are one of them. With that, Morristown has 6 pilots. As you know, the assessed value of those properties then gets taken out, so that will change the equalized ratio between us and Morristown. By doing pilots, then it benefits our taxpayers in the long run because it keeps that ratio right around that 65-35 split. If Morristown continues to do pilots and the township doesn't, you're going to see that ratio going in an adverse way for Morris Township residents. So we need to be part of this funding source, and it also benefits our residents both on the local level of keeping the municipal rate stable, and also helping our residents funding the school budget through that equalized ratio.
Okay, so I have a few questions.
Yes, ma'am.
So if you look at the pie graph, this one,
Yes, ma'am.
so each of those, the school district, the municipal, which is the town, the county, and the library, are all taxing bodies. Is that
That is
right?
correct. They're all taxing bodies, and their budgets come forward. The library is a little bit different because it's statutory, was it checking a little bit on the third of a mil for the library. So the library is done by statute, and the other taxing authorities are the county, the school district, and the town.
And so the
all
way
that
each
budget.
of those taxing bodies determines their budget, they determine their budget, which determines the amount of the tax levy that needs, the amount of money they need to raise
Correct.
to meet their budget.
Correct.
And then the way the tax dollars are calculated is, if you go to the next slide, that one, this shows the rate per $100 of value,
Yes.
right? And so, for example, to determine what your tax is for, this is Morris Township, you would multiply your, you would take 0.420 times the number of $100 in your assessed value of your
Correct.
home, right?
Correct, you would take your assessed value divided by the 100,
Mhm.
and then times it by the dollar amount that is listed there. So the average home in Morris Township following the reval in 2016 was $560,000. So that's what we use for these slides, is what that value is.
The average value of
Of
the
a
average home value in Morris Township.
Back in 2017.
Correct.
Following the 2016 reval,
Okay,
which is now skewed a little bit because
Yes.
it's now about 94%. It's going to go down to what, about 93.9. So as Mrs. Biarenko said, as that goes down, it's inverse. So your property value is will be up somewhere around a little over $600,000.
and so I would just encourage individual taxpayers, if you haven't done so already, take a look at your tax bill. And in the upper right-hand corner of your tax bill are the rate per $100 for each of the taxing bodies. And that's how you figure out the amount that you owe to each of these taxing bodies.
Correct.
And that amount is based on the assessed value of your home.
Yes, and also to determine that dollar amount is based on equalized value
Correct.
from the county, the schools, and the library.
And that's where the equalized value of all the properties in your entire town becomes important.
Extremely important because
Yes.
that ratio has an impact on how much the average taxpayer will pay.
Yeah. So it's complex, but it's something to keep in mind for understanding how your taxes are determined and for understanding the effect of pilots.
Correct. As you will look at the school, the pendulum has swung in Morristown's favor for the past several years.
Mhm.
So where Morristown, for the last 3 years, we've had to raise on the school budget just under $1 million, $1.175 million, and for the school year going into it now, a little over $2 million to our taxpayers. So.
In other words, the way the school funding is, or the budget is determined is that the school district determines the amount of tax levy, the amount of money it needs to meet its budget obligations.
Correct.
And then Morris Township is responsible, our taxpayers together are responsible for paying 65% of that cost. And Morristown is responsible for paying 35% of that cost.
Roughly, yes, and that ratio is established by, is it the Department of Education in the state on that?
I think it is the state, yeah.
Right, it's a formula within the state, so we get that when Morris School District is putting their budget together, they're also getting the information from the state as to what that
Cost share.
cost share is going to be. Mr. Revaluing sends it to both myself and to Morristown to review it, and you know, I look for Mrs. Viarengo, she did a yay or nay, and you know, we say yes, that we're in agreement with it.
Okay, and so then from Morris Township's point of view, that 65% of the total school budget is then divided proportionally between the taxpayers in our town according to the assessed value of their properties.
Correct.
And by a complicated formula, you figure out the multiplier that you multiply, it's the rate per $100.
Correct.
And so hopefully that makes sense. But if you take a look at your tax bill and look at those rates, it to me, it really, it's worth at the time to do that. It makes sense.
Pilots do have an impact on that ratio.
Yes,
So
they do.
As the properties are taken out of that ratio, then it impacts one way or the other. It helps out the municipality because they're getting more money to keep the municipal rate stable, or not going up or to do special projects that they might not be able to do. But you have to take a look at it and make sure that, or where it's equalized, that you're not hurting the residents.
But none of the taxing bodies is deprived of the money they need to meet their budget.
Now, they're all taxing authorities, and what they vote on is what goes to the Morris County Tax Board in establishing the final rate that we receive and get certified when we send out the tax bill in July.
Except for the library.
The library is a little different.
It's a little bit different. It's a third of it, no, it's statutory, but it also has to be certified by the Morris County Tax Board.
Right, but they don't get this, they don't get to state a budget. They take what they get and they have to make a budget out of what they take in.
Correct.
So we've heard people say that pilots deprive the school system of money. And we've had that conversation at one of our township committee meetings. How would you address that comment?
That is not an accurate statement. The school district will always get 100% of the money that the school board authorizes in their budget and approves their budget, and then that money will get divided. The school district will always get the money. It's kind of like pizza pie that was spoken about. It's how you divide that pie up. And so when those properties come out, there may be a little bit higher that the average resident pays, but they're going to see it on the municipal level side where they're not going to be paying as much. So we don't have to raise the taxes. So we said, look at the slide, the driving force on your property taxes is the school district, especially here in Morris Township, where municipal tax rate has remained very, very stable or flat, or hasn't gone up much over the last 10 years. They're very, very close to being flat. Even though all of our expenses go up, we've been able to offset a lot of that with the added assessments for new development or assessments for construction.
Okay. Anyone else? Mr. Grayzel, do you have any questions?
So just to bring it full circle, because we're here to talk about pilots. So given that the school district is a taxing authority, the county is a taxing authority, the fact that the pilot is or is included or excluded for the equalized value doesn't matter, because the school district is still getting their money, whether the pilot's in or the pilot's out. County's still getting their money, whether the pilot's in or the pilot's out, although the county does get the 5%, but they are getting less than they normally would. That just everybody understands that those taxing authorities are getting their money. And as Mr. Quinn just tried to explain to the public, the fact that the township gets 95% of a pilot payment offsets the amount that might otherwise go to the school district and get taken out of the pocket of taxpayers. So it's an offset for our taxpayers. And we haven't, I don't know if we've done the math, but I would think it's probably beneficial to a Morris Township taxpayer getting money through a pilot and bringing it into the municipal budget at the end of the day.
Absolutely, especially when you have for the school with pilots being in both municipalities. If they're not close, it could be skewed a little bit for the taxpayer, for the payments for the school tax. Because all those properties are coming out of the total assessed value of the properties.
Right. Very good. And often we can look at certain examples. I guess the only example we can currently look at is what's over at the old Colgate site. But when you use a pilot, you often get something that's of greater value than was there previously. Is generally correct.
Absolutely.
Jeff says absolutely. So my point being is that the greater value drives higher tax revenues off of a site that would have lesser tax values without the pilot. And so at the end of the day, even though the pilot is, the developer's getting a discount on taxes, the overall value of taxes coming in from that property could often be higher at the end of the day. Is that correct, Jeff?
Completely correct.
Does that make sense?
Yes.
to everybody?
Of course.
Okay. I just tried to summarize that for the public.
I often
That's
think
good.
that people don't understand that you need to compare what you're getting from the pilot to what you were getting before. because there's no guarantee that what you're getting now would have happened without the pilot. As Jeff was saying before, many times it's necessary, or usually it's necessary to make the project work. So without it, you wouldn't have that shopping center, you wouldn't have those townhouses, you wouldn't have whatever it may be. You would have something less. So to compare it to what was built with the pilot is really not correct, because you don't know that that would have been built.
Mhm. Right. Now, on the flip side of that, for the average resident, you are getting a more intense use of whatever parcel that is. So that is the trade-off that we're looking at for these types of projects. You usually get a more intense use, but you get a higher return.
And also you're taking a blighted area and redeveloping it so that you're changing the character of what that property was from being blight or run down to something much more attractive and bring things to municipality.
Right, or in the case of the Abbey, and we're not talking about the payments tonight, but in terms of the Abbey, we're looking at a property that has a historic building that might otherwise have been torn down. And the opportunity to use a pilot has allowed us to preserve a historic structure in the process. So it's not just blighted areas, but it is the kind of opportunity that the Abbey presents to us as well.
And that building was deteriorating for years and essentially vacant, so would have continued, so.
With the government, like the Colgate property, it was an industrial and trying to find an industrial use.
We're still environmental, probably.
Yeah.
Exactly, so there was challenges with that, of finding someone to come in and buy that property for an industrial use, which had been zoned for.
Okay, moving on, we have Mr. Quinn, I believe has his digital hand raised. And Mr. Brooks, we'll come back to you after Mr. Quinn.
There we go. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you. Go ahead, George Quillen.
Thank you. I wanted to ask a few questions. One is about the pilots that currently exist in Morris Township and in the town of Morristown. I think Mr. Quinn said there are 6 pilots in the town of Morristown. Is that correct?
Can you speak up just a little bit, Mr. Quillen?
Yes, sorry.
A little trouble hearing you.
Is this better?
A little bit. Go ahead.
All right. Let me turn up my sound. I wanted to ask if it's true that there are 6 pilots in the town of Morristown. I think I heard Mr. Quinn say that.
Correct, I took that from their budget document for their revenue for 2020. Six different locations.
And in Morris Township, there are 3 related to the Colgate development. Are there any other pilots currently in place in Morris Township?
Yeah,
There are for affordable housing, as Mr. Lehrer spoke about, we do have some very small pilots for 100% affordable housing projects in Morris Township that have been in place for a number of years.
Okay. So
we currently only have one. We have 2 pilots, only one that we are currently collecting any funding on, and that's still growing. That's still in our property over at the former Colgate site. The other one being will be the marketplace once it's built, and also there'll be a small, very, very small pilot for the affordable housing over at the Colgate site also.
Okay, thank you. I was very pleased to see that the percentage split of the school expenses between Morristown and Morris Township have been so stable over time. I wasn't sure that that would be the case. So it seems that whatever seesaw effect of pilots in the 2 different towns has had on the split, it hasn't been very dramatic. So I think that's good. And I did want to mention, I don't think this has been brought out very thoroughly or very explicitly in the discussion so far, that when a pilot is introduced in one of the 2 towns that share the school district, it changes the percentage split between the 2 municipalities in terms of who pays how much for the school district. So if a pilot is introduced in Morris Township and it's substantial in size, that would throw more expense for the school district toward Morristown and vice versa. And since Morristown is more urbanized, they, I would think, would tend to have an advantage in potentially introducing pilot programs within their municipality, which would tend to cause us to pay more of the school tax. But I see that the overall effect so far has not been very great, and the percentage has been pretty stable. So that was one thing that I wanted to at least mention. I guess it's not a question. My main question is about transparency of information and whether all the details of a pilot and how it's operating are publicly available and are shareable between the two municipalities that share the school district. Is Morris Township able to see exactly how each of the pilots in Morristown is operating? And is Morristown able to see exactly how all of our pilots are operating?
I can answer that question. As I mentioned, that a financial agreement, Mr. Quinn, is the mechanism that adopts the pilot agreement. It's called a financial agreement and it's adopted by ordinance. They are all public documents once they're adopted by the municipality. And it lays out all the details of annual service charge, annual gross revenue, the statutory periods where you break it down through the 30 years. So it's all public information once it's adopted by ordinance.
But the payment is dependent upon revenue, correct? So that, for example,
You are right. You are correct. The annual audit that they have to provide, once it's provided, is a quote government record that can be secured through an OPRA request, but it becomes a government record once it is submitted by the developer, an annual audit, because they're required to do it under the terms of the financial agreement.
so in order for Morristown to learn exactly what we're receiving, sorry, I say we meaning Morris Township because I live in Morris Township. Sorry for the informality. But in order for the town of Morristown to learn how much Morris Township is receiving in pilot payments in a particular year, or vice versa, in order for Morris Township to learn about Morristown's detailed pilot payments that are actually occurring, each of the towns would have to file an OPRA request to the other town. Is that correct?
Unless they voluntarily give it. Yeah, the answer is yes.
Or sometimes they're also, the payments are in the budget document.
If they're actually receiving payments at the time. Because
Correct.
it takes a while for these
Projects to get going.
payments to start coming in.
Correct.
So any property for which there is a pilot, the financial agreement should be available as a public document because it was passed by ordinance.
Correct.
Correct.
The income is also required to be provided by annual audit under the terms of the financial agreement. That becomes a government record once submitted annually. But until the project gets going, there's really not much to look at because it's not completed. And once they obtain a certificate of occupancy, that's when the obligation to submit an annual audit occurs.
Okay,
Okay, thank you very much.
so the information should be readily available about the financial agreements.
Correct.
Did you have anything else, Mr. Quillen?
Mr. Brooks, have another question?
Mr. Brooks?
Yes.
Mr. Brooks.
So, just up front, this is not a contradiction to what either Mr. Quinn or Mr. Quillen just expressed, but I always pointed out, I've been close to this for a lot of years as the library treasurer, these equalized values between Morristown and Morris Township. And while the percentage of what the municipalities collectively give to either the library or to the school or to the county changes. That's 65-35 or 60-40 or 70-30. It doesn't impact the individual taxpayer. So in other words, if I own a property in Morris Township that's worth $600,000, I am going to make a $200 payment to the library against that $600,000 value. If I own a property in Morristown that's worth $600,000, I am going to pay the exact same $200 to the library as the resident of Morris Township. It doesn't matter whether it's 65-35, 60-40, 70-30. I, as a personal taxpayer, am going to pay the same thing. And the same thing applies to the school district. So whether there's a pilot payment, a pilot program set up in Morristown or Morris Township, who ends up paying the difference are all of the ad valorem collective taxpayers in the two municipalities together, and what their equalized value together adds up to. Do you follow what I'm saying there?
I follow exactly what you're saying, Mr. Brooks. And do you want to answer that, Mr. Quinn?
What happens on Mr. Brooks is when the pilot assessed value of those properties comes out, it changes the ratio. And when the ratio changes, then one municipality or the other is going to get that benefit of paying a little bit less or paying a little bit more.
Yeah, but Tim, I guess what I'm saying is that the ratio of the municipalities may change, but it doesn't change what Jeff Brooks owes against a $600,000 property versus what Bob Jones owes against his $600,000 property in Morristown. We're going to pay the same exact thing to the school district, whether we live in Morristown or Morris Township, regardless of those pilot payments. Down at the individual taxpayer level, not at the collective. I agree with you 100%. It does change the collective, but it's not going to change my personal tax bill based on the equalized value of my property, not the assessed value, but the equalized value.
No, I don't know. It has to change because we have an assessment from the school district. We have to divide that up. And that assessment is based on equalized ratio. So if that goes up, we only have so many properties and the value of those properties, that's going to change what you pay for your school tax.
Yeah, Jeff, if I could try to explain it, Jeff and everybody else, there's a big pie where the school district divides up the amount of money we need between the two towns, right? That's decided by equalized value. And then once that division is set, your $500,000 property, or whatever number you use, is a proportion, your proportion of your municipality's payment to the school district is based off of the value of your property within your municipality. So it's almost like a second pie. They divide up the big pie between the two municipalities, and once each municipality knows how much they have to give to the school district, we have our own pies that we divide up, and that's where your value of your home comes in compared to the value of a home in Morristown.
I'm sorry, I just disagree with you because the original mathematics of the big pie was just based on the collective value of everybody in Morristown and Morris Township. So the math just says, okay, if there's a total value in both municipalities of $7.5 billion and we're $5 billion of it and they're $2.5 billion of it, we're going to pay 2/3, they're going to pay 1/3. And then how you split it up amongst the 1/3 and the 2/3, it's just because they own collectively $2.5 billion worth of property and we own collectively $5 billion worth of property. The math doesn't prorate down differently.
I will say, Mr. Brooks, that the issue that you're raising is exactly the question that I raised today. And I ran the numbers on a house at the value of $500,000. What would the tax be in Morris Township? What would the tax be in Morristown? And they were not equal. And I'm told that that's because the ratio, what's the term for that? The
Equalized value.
No, the
No.
No, it's basically the town has not been, there has not been a reval since 2000, I don't know, many years. The ratio, like our assessed values are closer to the actual.
Yeah, but
value.
again,
The market ones are.
Mayor
And
Wilson,
the-
it's not based on, Mayor Wilson, it's not based on the assessed value that I'm talking about. I'm talking about the market value. And back to Kathryn's point earlier, the equalization formula isn't perfect, right? Every property throughout the town doesn't go up and down exactly the same amount in value, but it's a pretty good approximation over time of what the market value is of your home. So my statement is based on the market value. You should pay the same amount on your school tax and your library tax based on, if you have the same market value in the two municipalities, your payment should be the same.
Right.
It's going to be different on assessed value, so what it shows on your tax bill will be different.
Correct?
No, that's correct.
Yeah.
If I'm not mistaken, what Deputy Mayor Grayzel was referring to is that you use the equalized valuation in each town, in Morristown, Morris Township Library, to arrive at the cost share. But when you know how much of that cost share is attributable to each municipality, it's divided up based on the non-equalized assessed value. Is that correct? I mean, I'm not a budget expert, but I think that's how it works.
It's,
So when you have a disparity in the equalized value and the non-equalized value, in other words, Morristown's equalization ratio is 73%, ours is 94% this year, rounding. But, you know, if you take the unassessed value, theirs are going to be much lower. And that's how the costs are divided up in the municipality.
Yeah, but I'm sorry, the 74% is only because it's been a much longer time since they reassessed. Again, it's supposed to put the apples to apples market value of properties in one town versus another town. So regardless of when they were last assessed and what the assessed value is, that shouldn't play into it at all. All that really should matter is that they did an appropriate equalization. So again, if the market value of my property in Morris Township is 600,000 and the market value of the property in Morristown is 600,000, regardless of what our assessments are, because they're going to be different, we should pay the same amount to the library and to the school district.
That may be based on market value, but your tax bill is based on your assessed.
Well, not really for the school and for the library and for the county. It's really based on your
Yes,
market
it is.
value.
Yeah.
it has to be. That's the only way we can value it is by your assessed value. All of your taxes are based on your assessed value of your property.
Yeah, I'll stop there. I disagree, but I've spoken enough.
Well,
Thank
if
you.
you look at your tax bill, it'll show you the assessed value. And then it'll show you what you're paying, and that's all based on your assessed value, not your market value.
Right, but if I in Morris Township multiplied my assessed value, or I'm sorry, divided my assessed value by 0.92, and I compared that to someone in Morristown who divided their assessed value by 0.74, and if we came up with the same amount, we would notice on our tax bills that we were paying the exact same amount to the library and to the school.
That may be, but
Okay,
so-
And it's just to say,
Yeah.
From pilots, I mean, we're here to discuss pilots, and I think we're getting a little bit off track.
well, and I guess my larger point is I shouldn't say who loses out, who ends up having to pick up the slack of the portion of the 95% that's not going to the school is the rest of the taxpayers in the two towns collectively. It doesn't fall more on one municipality versus the other. We all collectively in Morristown and Morris Township have to, if it's a $128 million school budget, which is going to be next year, we've got to pay $128 million, and it's shared between those who own property in the two towns, and it's going to be pro rata equal based on our market value of our properties. That's it.
okay.
I do agree with the last portion of what you said.
It's not market value, Jeff.
No.
Tax, okay, we're gonna move on.
But-
I will say thank you for bringing this up. The old teacher in me can feel that this would make a really good activity for working some math problems and using some actual numbers and examples, but we don't have that right now. So I think there is overlap in what we're saying, but there's a few points that we are perhaps can discuss offline. So with that, is there anything else you wanted to comment on there, Mr. Brooks, or was that your main comment?
He muted himself.
You muted, okay.
That's all. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Heidi Ross. Heidi. I think we need you to unmute.
Okay,
He's
how,
unmuted.
Heidi, go ahead.
good evening.
Good evening.
I guess I have two brief questions. One is the pie chart that Tim showed stated 60%, whereas the chart with the equalization ratios shows something more like 65%. Maybe that could just be clarified. And then Tim you made a comment about the fact that with the Morristown having more pilots than Morris Township, that I guess I wasn't clear exactly a point you were making about the fact that, you know, having pilots in Morris Township was going to be more to our advantage. Maybe you could just clarify why you have that opinion.
So the first one, the 60%, that's the percentage of your tax dollars. The other one, the other ratio we talked about was the split for the school district budget between the town of Morristown and the township.
Oh, right. Okay, I see. Yes. Okay, I'm with you. I'm tracking on that. Mhm.
For the assessed value of pilot properties comes out of that tax base. So, or actually, I'm sorry, the aggregate value, assessed value of all of those properties. So without having those in there, it can change that ratio between the two municipalities. And that's why it's important that we also have pilots, especially if it's important for Morristown to have pilots. It's a very good revenue source to keep our municipal budget stable. And we also want to make sure that we each are paying our fair share to the Morris School District.
Does that answer your question, Heidi?
I'm not sure. I'll try and digest that, and I can get back to it another time.
It does,
I-
you have to
I
think
need-
about it, it's complex.
Yeah, it is indeed. Thank you, though.
Thank you. George Quillen, do you have another question?
Hi, yes, thank you. I just wanted to say that I don't believe I agree with Mr. Brooks about the effect of pilot programs on taxation. It may be that, and I should be careful because I certainly have much less experience and less expertise than he does, and that many of the members of this panel do as well in this matter. But it seems to me that when a municipality enters into a pilot program, it gives them revenue and it allows them to collect less in ad valorem taxes going forward. So there may be no effect immediately, but down the road, a homeowner is likely to be taxed at a lower rate because of pilot programs that have been entered into within his or her town, as opposed to the other town that shares a school district and a library with his or her town. Sorry for the convoluted grammar, but I guess I just want to say that
I agree with
I
Mr.
disagree with the basic point.
Yeah,
We concur.
we agree.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Is there anyone else? No?
No.
Okay,
Mr. Lehrer is going to follow up with some bullet points on this now to wrap up the.
Okay,
Just as a
Very
summary,
good.
yes, thank you, Mayor.
Thank
This
you.
has been an interesting evening, and I really enjoyed sharing with the public and you some of the intricacies of pilots. But just as a summary, long-term tax abatements are authorized by state law. The law was created to help municipalities efficiently and responsibly develop underutilized and deteriorating properties. The long-term tax abatements are only permitted in areas that have been determined to be an area in need of redevelopment, as I mentioned. The law allows municipalities to enter into agreements by way of financial agreement whereby they make annual service charge payments in lieu of taxes, also called pilots, instead of conventional taxes. The duration of that time is 30 years from the completion of the project, or not more than 35 years from the signing of the financial agreement. The pilot can be calculated as a percentage of annual gross revenue or as a percentage of total project cost. The redeveloper must be an urban renewal entity, which is a limited dividend or nonprofit entity, and the excess profits that they receive beyond 12.5% have to be turned over to the township, and it's subject to an annual audit. Upon the expiration of the abatement, the property returns to conventional ad valorem taxes. Commercial properties continue to pay their land taxes. As mentioned, the abatement for commercial properties is only on the improvement. Municipalities retain much more of the pilot payment than they would under conventional taxes, and tax abatements are often necessary to offset extraordinary on-site or off-site rehabilitation or construction costs, including environmental costs. Pilots have been shown to encourage private investment, promote balanced growth, and provide economic development opportunities that are essential to the long-term financial health of a community. And the schools continue to be fully funded with no loss of revenues. And with that, I will conclude my remarks.
thank you, Mr. Lehrer. I'd like to thank Mr. Lehrer, Mr. Quinn, Mrs. Viarengo, Mr. Sims, and Mr. Grayzel for joining us tonight. I hope the information you learned this evening is good background to help you understand and participate effectively in our public hearing on the Abbey on Thursday evening. And as I said at the beginning, it's a complex topic. I do anticipate having a further session on this in the future for additional information. You can see some of the questions that came up. I can imagine a further session in the future. And I just want to thank everyone for their contributions this evening, and I hope everyone has a great night. So thank you.
Thank you, Mayor.